firearms and such, right?
Sure. I just wouldn't have them in their uniform. I don't see any ability to, I would not put them in a situation where they're in a uniform without a firearm.
Right. But they would still be serving, right? Like, let's say that they were serving in none of those capacities and not in a uniform, but they were serving. That would still count towards their monthly service, right?
I don't see why not.
Right. And so therefore, they would still be actively engaged without a firearm in those circumstances, right?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that.
Right.
I
Right.
would
So
not
then,
be so narrow-minded, though. I mean, every time that we ask our officers, either reserve officers or regular officers, to do a certain detail, we do have to consider their safety and whether that particular assignment needs to be a uniformed assignment or not. With that said, excuse me, with that said, there is plenty of opportunities for civilians, and that's kind of how I look at this. If a civilian could do this job without a gun, then certainly our reserves could do it without a gun. However, when you're asking the reserves to do it in their capacity, then we would outfit them no differently.
right. So then you would agree that you as the chief have the discretion ultimately, and certainly lots of the documents that you provided to us further underscore this, that you as the chief have the discretion in a municipality that has an auxiliary force and in a municipality that has armed their auxiliary. You as the chief have the discretion to take their firearms in certain uh, in certain times of service as you see
Well,
fit.
so I'm not gonna argue semantics. That's for sure. Um, but what I can tell you is models work all around the country for fire police, where whoever's available, they come out and assist. Okay, but they're not in uniforms. They throw a vest on and they come out and assist. So there is absolutely no doubt about that. If they're performing in the role as a law enforcement officer, then they're going to be in the uniform and they're going to have their gun. So yes, there are two very distinct differences in time that they could be utilized.
Okay, great, thank you. And I think my follow-up is I just wanted to get a better idea of how you understand the term training. What is training? Is it limited to certain things? Is it academy training? Is it the required training that's in the SOPs? What is training?
So I'm just like holding this. This is
Right.
I brought both the Title 8, Title 40A revised statutes on training clarifications for officers, as well as what their curriculum is for the police academy, and we have to maintain those standards. So whether they're out with their gun or without their gun, they're trained with the full. So I have their curriculum. Okay, they're trained for the full powers and authority to be a police officer during the time that they're activated during an emergency. So during an emergency, there's virtually no difference between them and a regular police officer. So we trained them to that. As a part of their police academy, they've received use of force training. They've received traffic control training. They've received medical aid training, first aid training, Title 39 training, which is motor vehicle law, how to conduct motor vehicle stops. So where I don't train where I don't say what their training is going to be, the Police Training Commission decides what that's going to be. It's incumbent upon me to keep them up to snuff, if you will, keep them current on what their obligations to follow the law, to apply the law as it pertains to use of force, traffic stops, and everything. With that being said, when you talk about training, everything that they're doing either during their meetings or when they're out on a road, is considered training, and that training is based on what OEM believes their needs were going to be in an emergency. So we train. So basically, we train for when an emergency could occur. So as now, we are in a state of emergency now. So if the reserves were activated, I'd have them in the center help them with the social distancing and the masks. They're not activated, so they're not in there doing that, or I'd have them doing that. And just like the law, not my SOP allows, they would be enforcing the law, which they have been trained to do. They would be providing both traffic and crowd control, which we're trained to do. So the two kind of go together.
Okay, so let me ask my question in a better way, and I apologize for not asking it well. And thank you for letting us know again that our auxiliary are fully trained. There's a lot of misconception and misinformation in the community that our auxiliary police members receive less training than other police officers. They receive the same amount of training. They train alongside our police officers, and we can go into that later tonight if there's a question relating to that. I'm trying to dive us deeper into the definitions here, right? Because I think this is going to help us in coming out on the other side with a decision. When you look at all of the advisory opinions from the Attorney General, when municipalities before us have had this discussion and they've asked for guidance, when you look at the state laws, and when you look at the history of the auxiliary force in the state of New Jersey, that which means that the auxiliary came into being as an extension of the Office of Emergency Management. It was a civilian defense force to
Right.
respond to emergencies and disasters, war emergency, weather-related emergencies, and other disasters, right? So considering that context, we have seen in the documents that you provided that it is, again, in a municipality that has an auxiliary and in a municipality that has decided to arm their auxiliary members, it is common practice for them to have their firearm issued to them during their response to an emergency, a disaster, or during training,
Right.
right? And I think what the public is going to ask tonight, because they've been sending us emails, and what I'm scratching my head about after reviewing these documents over and over again is, well, is everything they do every day training or responding to an emergency? Yes, for instance, in your example, we're in a state of emergency right now due to the public health emergency, right? So if they went to the center to ensure that people were masking up, the center meaning the village,
Right.
um, they're required to do their firearms, to have their firearms. If we were to have them help kids cross Clinton School back when kids go back into school, and they're supporting the other officers and the crossing guards who are there, is that also training because it's part of their normal everyday opportunity to learn how the process works? Then if we accept that broad definition of both emergency and training, then we're saying, we're going back to the first step, which is, well, nope, I can't see any circumstance where the auxiliary can still engage and serve, but without a firearm. It's always going to be emergency and it's always going to be training. But I don't think you mean that, right?
No, actually, I do mean that. The if you read what the OEM says about the police auxiliaries, it doesn't say anything about using the auxiliaries in such a way other than for training in case of emergency. It does not talk about how to utilize an auxiliary force um, to replace something that's missing in the police department. It's inappropriate to use it in that way. So when they're coming out and working in the village for whatever reason, or we're teaching them things such as crowd control or how to enforce certain laws, it's all considered training. It's never routine that they're coming out just to come out. They're not just coming out to come out. They're coming out to further learn and to further train for times of an emergency such as this. Their time that they volunteer, although sometimes I can say they probably train on our policies and our mandatory trainings more than they actually come out and volunteer. But when they come out, they are coming out for the purpose of training in case of an emergency. They're not just here.
Okay, so it is your opinion as the chief of the Maplewood Police Department that whether it's crowd control, crossing guard support, event support, national night out, or emergency response, helping secure a fire or a closed down street due to a weather emergency, um, all of that, traffic stops, all of those possible duties for an auxiliary in Maplewood are either going to be emergency or training and therefore justify the use of the firearm. Is that your opinion?
No, I don't associate the use of the firearm with that, but yes, I agree with it that it's training. So
Okay.
when they're out there, although they are, remember, these are our community members, so they're volunteering as community members to support these events and activities that we have. So I don't want to hold that against them, which it sounds like it's being held against them.
No, no, no,
However,
no, 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 no. Chief, chief,
they
chief,
just happen
chief,
to be reserve
chief,
officers.
chief, let's not do this tonight. Let's not do this tonight. We're not going to do this tonight. We're
Wait,
not.
can I interject for a second?
Wait a minute. No, Miss Adams, I was speaking. When I'm finished, you can speak, okay? Let's not interrupt each other. And we should have said this in the beginning, actually, Chairman. Let's not let our rhetoric, our passion get in the way of the substance here, because I really do think that we're all here to really understand all of this better so we can make the right decision for the community, right? So
well, I would agree with that, Deputy Mayor Davis. I'm remiss for not saying that earlier, but I would also just say that, I think we should, let's keep the questions to questions and save the argument for later, because some of this is, I think, verging on cross-examination and the back and forth here is not really necessarily information seeking. Some of this seems more agenda driven.
I don't have an agenda. I'm really, truly trying to understand what emergency and training means. But you know what? That question will come from the public soon enough. So I will step away and let the public answer that question or
Okay.
ask that question.
So, Chief, I had a question because there's a couple different legal options that are available to the township. One of which is a CERT team, a community emergency response team. And
Sure.
my understanding is that, is that group is not armed, and some communities do have that. And in fact, Maplewood used to have a community emergency response team. I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about, and maybe I just highlighted one of the differences, but the difference between an auxiliary police force and a CERT team, and if you have any historical context in terms of, why Maplewood used to have both, and now, at some point, no longer had a CERT.
Well, the CERT team, well, I could tell you this. Not many people want to volunteer to be a police auxiliary because of the amount of training that we require for them. One, to hold their firearms. Two, they're empowered to arrest people. Okay, so many of the powers that a police auxiliary have, a CERT team member would not. They're merely coming out there to help us with our events, direct some traffic. We will provide training in certain areas for them. They will not be utilized for things like crowd control. That wouldn't be their function. So at our events, they would be helping guide people. They might be helping cross people. We wouldn't use them at night in most circumstances, but they certainly have a role, and they are not nearly as trained. They're very specifically trained for very direct and narrow things compared to our police auxiliaries. They're not authorized to use force. They're not authorized to carry weapons, enforce the law. two complete different things, but there is a role for both.
Okay. And it looked like we had questions from our colleagues. You know, I think Committeewoman Adams or Committeeman DeLuca. I just wanted to give them an opportunity here if they were looking to say something.
I just want, thanks, Greg. I just wanted to clarify. I think we keep, or what I keep hearing is the terms being used of use of firearms and carrying firearms are being interchanged. So when Dean, you were saying, so there are, you know, you think the use of firearms is necessary at this. That's not what I'm hearing our chief say. What I'm hearing our chief say is that you don't know what's going to arise in policing at any given situation. So, and I'm not advocating one way or the other. I'm just trying to understand and maybe help clarify for what the chief is saying. He's not, what I'm hearing is not use of firearms, which is what keeps being put out there. I'm hearing, just like I'm hearing the auxiliary police carrying firearms, just like the police carry firearms. To me, that's very different than use of firearms. And since they're in situations that most likely will not require the use of firearms, if they don't have them, they can't use them should the need arise. So whether or not, so I feel like there's a confluence of terms like that's not helpful in this situation, because it's inflammatory in the terminology and in what you're talking about allowing trained officers, whether auxiliary or police, do. And so I'm trying to get past all this other stuff and get to, you know, when the chief is saying they need to carry firearms, or and those who are seemingly opposed to them carrying firearms, which is the issue, are using the term use of firearms. So Chief, can you speak to that, please? And maybe I'm missing something.
Well, I think I'm not going to speak for the deputy mayor as far as the use of firearms and or that. I believe that the context is we are asking our reserve officers, not a CERT officer or not some other random person or a fire police person. We are asking our auxiliary officers to perform a service. And it's up to me as the chief to find that there is some training component in there, so that way it is covered by the Office of Emergency Management, and that it furthers their training and their qualifications, and I would not ask them to do that work unarmed and not carry a weapon under those circumstances. So the use of the firearm goes hand in hand, and the carrying of the firearm goes hand in hand with the duties and responsibilities of the auxiliaries. So I hope I said that clear enough. If you're asking them to be a police auxiliary, we've armed them, we've trained them. We can't predict what is going to happen. They are in uniform. They can't be distinguished between anybody else. We're asking them to enforce laws at any particular time. So I think that very much distinguishes between what a served person would do and what we are asking our auxiliary officers to do.
Thanks, Chief. Sorry, Mr. DeLuca, did you have a question?
I did, thank you. I thought I would raise my hand. I think that might be a good idea. We might want to practice here. So, Chief, thank you. I had a question. I found the letters from the various attorney generals and what have you useful. I just want to clarify, and thank you. I think you've clarified the difference between CERT, which is really different than the police auxiliary.
Yes.
And I've dealt with both of them, and I think you're absolutely right. There's really, one is not anything like the other. But as I see this, this was, let me just get the date. This was June 12th, 1987. It came out of the Attorney General's office to the Superintendent of State Police. And as I read this, it says that a local governing body and chief of police may authorize auxiliary police officers to carry firearms, and it says under two conditions: only while on duty during a declared emergency and disaster, correct?
Yes.
That's one condition, is that correct?
Yes.
And then it says and only while participating in a duly authorized training exercise in preparation for such occurrences.
Yes.
So those are the two things, right? It's the declared emergency or disaster, or training in preparation for an emergency or disaster.
Yes, that's what I was mentioning before.
Okay.
We don't utilize our officers in a way that they just come out willy-nilly, either to save money on officers or because you wanted to put on a show.
Okay. So, and then it also says, if I just, let me just scroll down a little bit, so bear with me a bit. It also says that the carrying of firearms is, it doesn't have to be all the time. It can be sometimes. Is that correct?
Sure.
So even though you meet those two criteria, one being an emergency or disaster or training, there can be a choice as to whether or not someone carries a firearm at other times, or either in those two times. Even for a disaster, you might not have someone be armed.
Depending, sure.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's the circumstances, right?
Yes.
You weigh that. Okay. So this is the thing that I don't understand exactly. So I guess police departments, because I see other police departments that have armed auxiliaries, are very similar to the way we assign our auxiliary. They do crowd control, they do traffic control, they do church duty, they do functions like you mentioned. They also ride with the police. They go to crime scenes, things like that.
Yes.
So my sense is that police departments define training very broadly to do, because and I know we haven't gotten to that document yet, but let's see, what is the title of that document? Just 1 second. The Maplewood Police Auxiliary Assignment process, I'm sorry, the assignments, we talk about Sunday church being a training exercise. Is that correct?
Yes.
And night patrols being a training exercise.
Yes.
So those being training exercise allows the carrying of a firearm. Is that correct? I mean, if we didn't define them as training, then they wouldn't meet the criteria of being able to
Well,
carry
yes. I mean, more broadly, I was going to indicate that we've allowed them to carry the firearms, so they would naturally carry the firearms. I'm not so sure that the two to go together.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Because I'm just trying to figure out, I'm not sure where we're going to land next Tuesday, but I certainly know that, having dealt with plenty of emergencies on my time on the township committee, including Sandy, where we did have fights among people at gas stations, and we had other crowd control issues, that having the auxiliary with some police power was helpful.
Yeah.
I also know
We get requests all the time from our religious institutions, Mr. DeLuca, and that is related to presence during their holidays, ceremonies, events, because of things that are going around in the world. And they're not there to cross somebody. They're there and they ask us for that presence. And certainly we need to train for those things. So a lot of the things that you could bring up have a legitimate training function that also serve a need at a request from our community.
Okay, so you say it. So now I'm understanding what you're saying. So it's not sort of black and white, because there's a lot of gray stuff. So even a church duty might be security detail.
Yes, and
Okay.
frequently they ask for that.
Okay. All right. Because I'm just trying to figure out.
Holidays.
I have a deep respect for the auxiliary and all that they have done, and I was just trying to find out: is there some distinction in their duties that we could look at and understand better? And so I just want to. I'm clear about the law and why they're allowed to carry arms. I just want to look now. I think we have to focus on the practice and what's our procedures and what are we assigning folks to do, and whether that continues to make sense to have them be armed or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Committeeman DeLuca. Just sort of continuing to go through the documents that we distributed. The next one, Committeeman DeLuca actually just referred to, which was the Maplewood Police Auxiliary assignment process. That was very useful in terms of laying out the minimum time commitments that are required for auxiliaries, on a monthly basis, yearly basis, et cetera, the different duties they have, what happens when new recruits are brought on and how they're trained, the liaison officer that is assigned by the chief to, is a full-time Maplewood police officer who serves as a liaison to the auxiliaries and their applicability of the internal affairs process to the reserves. Chief, one question that I realize I was probably remiss in not including in the frequently asked questions. I think we discussed it at our meeting back in July, and it's a question that the public has been asking, it's one that, if it can't be addressed by you, maybe our business administrator, Ms. Viveros, is on. She might know. But what kind of insurance coverage does the township have for the auxiliary officers? And so if something were to happen to or with one of the auxiliary officers while he or she was on duty, would that fall under the township's insurance policy? And what type of coverage do we have for that? And I guess that question would be either for the chief or for Ms. Viveros.
I'll take that one, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
They're covered just like any other employee would be covered.
Okay, so while they're on duty, in terms of anything that were to happen to them or that they were to do while on duty would be the same as any other member of the police department.
Correct. And we typically provide coverage for whatever amount of auxiliary officers we have for that year. So I believe we're currently insured between 23 and 25.
Okay. Chief, another issue that I wanted to bring up, we talked about CERT, and I appreciate, along with Committeeman DeLuca, you laying that out clearly. Another legal option that's available to communities that's sort of in between auxiliary police, or could be, I guess, supplemental to auxiliary police, but not full-time officers, are what's known as special officers. There's special ones and special twos in New Jersey. And I was
Yes.
wondering if you could sort of tell us what that is, and also, how those are used in other departments. And, the example of Newark, which is obviously a much bigger city, but is a neighboring community, jumps out, whereas Newark has obviously a large full-time police force. They also have an auxiliary police force, which isn't armed, but then they have specials that I believe are armed. So I realize I just asked you several questions, but if you can maybe start by telling us about what special 1 and 2s are, and then how they're used in other communities, and then maybe specifically what the relationship is in Newark, where they have all three: a full-time police, specials, and an auxiliary.
Okay, so just to differentiate between the auxiliaries and the specials 1, 2, or 3. Auxiliaries are a function of Office of Emergency Management. Class 1, 2, and 3s are not. Class 3s are retired law enforcement officers. Class 2, they have arrest powers and carry weapons. Generally speaking, municipalities use them for very specific roles and functions, and they have limitations on hours that they could work. That's basically to avoid union issues. But they are, a class 2 is essentially a full-fledged police officer. Carry, make powers of arrest and everything. Class 1 officers have no powers of arrest. They're limited in the scope. Matter of fact, to be a class 1 officer for the PTC, you need 80 hours of training. Even our reserve officers get substantially more training than that. I equate a class 1 officer to a security guard who does not have either a need or capability of carrying. There are security guards who have carry permits, but generally speaking, a class 1 would be similar to that. They could do traffic control, and they're not volunteers. They're paid, by the way, but they can do a very narrow function, which is issue summonses, but they have no powers of arrest and they don't carry a weapon. And the utilization is really very simple. Shore towns use class 1s because they stick them in a uniform without a gun, and then they ask them to do parking enforcement officer things. They ask them to be a presence on the boardwalk without having a law enforcement capacity or capability. The class 2 officers, they are full-time officers, carry weapons and powers of arrest, and they are actually used to supplement their departments. So towns such as Newark, such as Parsippany will use class 2 officers in place of regular officers where their union contracts allow.
Okay, so Chief, in the Newark situation, they obviously have the full-time police officers, which I think we're all familiar with. They have an unarmed auxiliary, and then they have special 2s. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know if they have special 1s. I do know they have special 2s.
Okay, and those special 2s are paid, are armed, and they're basically full police officers. They just have a limitation on the number of hours they can work because of the union contracts.
Correct. And they have to be given a very narrow field of duty, such as they could work the Bears Stadium when that was there, or the Prudential Center, that type of thing.
Gotcha. Okay, thanks, Chief. And and maybe I'm misremembering, but I think maybe going back a few years, but I didn't we actually hire someone who'd been a special 2 in Newark?
We have several.
Yeah. I mean, because I know that's sort of where I first became familiar with the program, because we started seeing folks coming in to interview for our department with that experience. So thank you, Chief. I appreciate that information and those clarifications. So just to finish walking through the documents before we take any other questions, more broadly, document F was a 2018 report on hours of service, special events, and training for the auxiliary that laid out the different events they went to, the different trainings they received by month. 2019, the same thing is in document G. Document H is a list of additional assignments that auxiliary police have done that I think, went beyond what was in those reports, maybe from prior years. There was the roster from 2020, which, I know rosters, even of full-time departments, but particularly of volunteers, are moving targets because you have people coming out and people going in.
Sure.
Chief, I think we're currently at 13 and soon to go down to 12 with a retirement coming up. Is that right?
That's accurate.
Right. So, there's another document on the expenses incurred to outfit a new Maplewood Police Auxiliary officer, down to the dollars and cents you provided us for the vest, the uniform, the psychological testing, the other evaluations, and ammunition. And I assume the ammunition is both so they can, have it in the firearm they might carry while on duty, but also for qualification. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And that came out to just around $4,000 to outfit a new member. And is that a one-time cost or is that an annual cost for each member?
The uniforms are replaced as needed. That's usually every 5 to 6 years, not very often. The only reoccurring expense is the ammunition, but we buy it in bulk, so it's very, very low.
Okay, and you buy it. That's just, you don't buy special ammunition for the
No.
auxiliary, right? Do you have? Okay, so you buy it along with the ammunition you're buying for the department overall, and then the evaluations, the psychological, the vest, things like that, presumably are one-time expenses, right?
Yes.
I guess maybe a vest might need to be replaced at some point, but
That's
so,
10 years.
okay. And then the final document, document K, in the packet we put together was the transcript of our July meeting, where we, Chief, I'm sure you'll fondly recall the 40 questions that we went through. And that was really to give the public the benefit of what was a very lengthy discussion that night, going through questions, and I think we did our best, the Public Safety Committee, to sort of summarize a lot of that information in the FAQ document, the 5 or 6 pager that we included. But in case people wanted to see the full transcript of that meeting and have the benefit of that discussion, we included that. So that brings us to the end of the documents that were provided. And I wanted to now open it up to maybe general questions or certainly any questions about the documents that we didn't ask to my colleagues on the committee. Any questions for Chief DeVaul?
Mr. Chairman, I don't have any more questions. I'd like to open it up for the public since they've been waiting.
Okay, so yeah, so before I open to public comment, I just want to see if Mr. DeLuca, Ms. Adams, or Mr. Daffis have any questions for the chief.
Nope.
I actually have one question.
Okay,
Chief,
Committeeman DeLuca.
Chief, are you familiar with the auxiliaries in towns that are not armed, like Bloomfield?
Not particularly.
Okay. All right, thank you.
I know. I'm familiar with Union as a neighboring town. I'm familiar with basically just what's around us, and such as Livingston. I'm friends with their chief, so how their reserves operate.
Right, but Livingston is they are allowed to carry firearms.
Correct. So just with whatever's within my chief's association, basically in our neighboring towns.
Okay. So the reason I asked was because do you have could you give us, in your opinion, what would be the functionality, the difference between, or the utility between having the police departments that have auxiliaries without carrying firearms and those that do?
It is what you're asking your auxiliary officers to do compared to what they're asking them to do. And I don't have the specifics on what they're having their officers to do. I mean, we are having our officers assist us with crime scenes. I mean, I don't want to go through the list again, but
No, I understand. Okay. I thought maybe you knew the difference. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. DeLuca. Unless one of my other colleagues wants to chime in, I think, the public has been very patient. I see 8 hands already raised. For the public, I'll just start taking, but just a reminder that we're going to limit comment to 3 minutes per person. I'll use my phone to stopwatch on my phone to time. Also, please spend a night, focused on, questions or clarifications. Just to reiterate, there'll be no decision made tonight by the Public Safety Committee or the Township Committee. That's going to be a discussion for Tuesday night, and that will be a meeting that obviously everyone is welcome to attend, and there'll be public comment at the beginning of that meeting. That's really the appropriate time before the vote to make comments that are more policy based in terms of what you would like the Township Committee to do on this issue. So with that, I thank the public for their patience, and I'm going to take it in the order that I see the hands up in my window here. The first hand I see up is Sarah Rothman. I'm going to allow you in, and you may just have to unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Great, okay. So I have a question. It's related to this letter from the Bloomfield Police Department, or I guess it was to the Bloomfield Police Department. So the letter states that auxiliaries, if they're regularly assigned to foot and vehicle patrol and are authorized to issue tickets, this practice should be terminated at once. And in some of the public documents that we requested from the town, there was a lot of information about the hours that the auxiliary was doing different functions. And it looked like, so like I'm looking at 2019. I know that not everybody had this document, so I'll read out some of the numbers. So total hours was 4,209. Sunday detail, 735 hours. Night patrols, 1,290 hours. And then the last bullet point is classroom and training, 1,013 hours. So I have 2 questions. The first is that this statistic looks like about 75% of the time is patrol or Sunday detail. And so the letter makes it seem like that's not authorized at all. And then also all the questions about like training and the semantics or whatever, but this was the way it was broken down when it was given to us, and it sort of separates training. So it's just not, those 2 things are not clear to me. And that's all.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Rothman. So, I think the chief made a distinction before, and I'll let the chief respond, but I think the chief made a distinction between sort of the practical training, the on-the-job training that they get, the auxiliary officers get in the field versus the classroom training they get, such as the Attorney General's training, use of force, implicit bias, et cetera. But Chief, can you address the questions that Ms. Rothman just raised regarding training, and why, in your view, that's not inconsistent with what's allowed of the auxiliary?
Sure. Again, I don't think that letter addresses what the duties and responsibilities of an auxiliary officer is. That seems to be targeted at an inappropriate use of the auxiliary for whatever reason. We don't use our auxiliary officers in that fashion. To distinguish once again with the training. To go along with what you said, Mr. Lembrich, you have the classroom training as required to keep them in compliance, and then you have the practical training, which is what they're doing that's on the road and at these events and details.
Okay, and Chief, the question about the letter to Bloomfield saying that, you know, that they shouldn't be used on patrol. I think you may have addressed that earlier.
Yeah.
But I think that may have had to do with the frequency. Is that what you said, or sort of being used in place of police?
That's correct. That's an inappropriate use of the officers for a certain circumstance, and we don't use our officers in that circumstance to replace police officers, to save money, to assign officers for favors as such, or to provide a special detail because you're looking to have more revenue. We don't use them that way.
Okay, thanks, Chief. We're going to move on to the next question. The next hand up is Gail Leibowitz. I'm going to allow you to talk. You may have to unmute yourself.
Hi. My question is, I think it's actually the same quotation that Vic DeLuca had read earlier, which is from it's a letter that says, "Dear Superintendent Pagano," but it says that the auxiliary, they should only be authorized, I'm a little bit paraphrasing, during an emergency or disaster or during training exercises in preparation for such occurrences. And then it says something very similar, that specifically the training should be for emergencies or disasters. So I'm pretty confused with this definition that, like, going on crossing guard duty or other duties that the auxiliary are doing, how that fits in with at least this piece here about how the training should actually be for emergencies and disasters, which seems to be the whole, like, authorization, law that this was authorized under in the first place. So, like, how does, like, all the other duties train for an emergency or disaster?
Chief, could you address that?
Sure. Traffic control and pedestrian safety is absolutely prevalent during an emergency. When we had just the storm recently, there was a time that we had up to 20 or 30 intersections out that needed to be manned by police officers. So the practice of learning how to direct traffic and to cross people during an emergency, when we have a weather emergency or other emergencies as well, this is where they get the experience to do that. And they don't perform outside of their job title. So we don't have them doing crossing guards work. We would just have a crossing guard do that.
And this is true of, like, guarding crime scenes and generic patrolling and so forth too? It just seems like there's a lot of duties here that don't.
Guarding crime scenes is an emergency.
A disaster?
Well, what an emergency is determined by us at the time.
Okay, thank you, Chief. I'm going to move on to the next member of the public. The next person with their hand raised is Vanessa Parvin.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to see if during this 90-day review period, anybody on your side has checked with the Attorney General to see whether we are in compliance with how the auxiliary is being used, especially the fact that they're armed. I know there's a lot of things going back and forth with documents going back to the 80s and before that, and I'm curious if we've taken it further up the chain.
So, Chief, I can answer that. That we have not reached out to the Attorney General's office. One of the things that, several of the letters from the Attorney General's office actually state is that, they're not looking to take the place of municipal attorneys and provide advice about the particular circumstances of individual townships. Chief jdevaul and I did have a conversation with our township attorney, Mr. Desiderio, and Mr. Desiderio, upon reviewing this, did not have legal concerns from his standpoint as township attorney. But, in terms of the Attorney General's office, I can represent that that's not something that we reached out to. Although, in the decades or so of this program being in existence, there's certainly, certainly I don't think any question's been raised until now. When we started talking about whether they'd be armed, about whether or not this is the first sort of over the last couple of days that I've been hearing any sort of concern that they're being used improperly or they're being used for things that are outside of the legal authority. So I'm not saying we couldn't do that, but the answer is that we haven't.
Okay,
Mr. Lembrich, we also have a chain of command when it comes to this unit as well. So we do report to the state police. They are if you look further into this, they are my direct report.
I just want to add one more thing before I'm cut off here. I have done a lot of homework on the history of the auxiliary, and I can answer you, Mr. Lembrich, that there have been letters to the editor published in the newspaper in the past, even going as far back as early in the 20th century with community members questioning the role of the auxiliary. So I do know that this is not a new conversation. And I ask about the AG because you led with a letter from the AG in the past. Thank you.
Thank you. The next person with their hand raised from the public is Suzanne Schaefer.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thanks so much for all the time tonight on this important discussion. I wanted to thank the previous commentators and questions around the difference and the important and in that statement about emergency and disasters and training, and ask specifically how we think about training evolving for our auxiliary roster. The roster's been posted for the past couple of years. I think the 16 people listed in the 2020 roster, 11 have more than 10 years on the auxiliary force, up to 30 years. I mean, it's amazing the dedication of these individuals, but I also wonder how our training evolves, right? So if we're thinking of all of these situations as trainings, I guess my question is, when does the apprenticeship model say, okay, you've got this, right? I mean, I think about, by the way, I'm in training and development and talent management. So much you have to evolve what is required for on-the-job training and when somebody has it. And so keeping out of it, maybe the ongoing training classes that you have distinguished, Chief jdevaul, but I'm just wondering, how do you think about that? And does that actually give maybe some leeway in terms of when we would think about being armed with a gun not necessary because people have reached their training quotas. They understand how to do this. They're proven, they're veterans of this force. So this can't be considered a training. Thank you.
Chief, I'll let you address that.
Well, I don't agree with that. So it's the fact that an officer has volunteered for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I believe that our officers are learning every day. I'm learning every day.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm asking is, when when are you able to say this person understands the protocols for being on night patrol, right? So if you are on night patrol, there's certain, I can imagine there's certain standards that have to be upheld. There's a protocol. When do you say this person knows how to do this? And how does that evolve, right? So that somebody who, you know, in their first couple of years, you're expected to be trained in these areas. In your next couple of years, you do this. When do those people become even the trainers? Is there sort of, do they become the leaders who actually help train others? And can that help be used to differentiate here?
Well, certainly the older auxiliaries help to train the newer auxiliaries. That works the same way that my full-time officers work. We have a constant flow of working with different officers, so that way you can gain different knowledge from each officer. That's something that we use with our full-time officers and we use with these officers. So, but I don't think they can get enough training.
Okay, the next member of the public with their hand raised is Nicolina Jennings.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. I had more of a clarifying question that I'm hoping Chief jdevaul can provide, specifically when, and more importantly, under what specific circumstances was the Maplewood Auxiliary Police Unit actually formed? Can you speak more to that?
No, I really don't have that. That may, Mr. Lembrich, did you include that in some of the documentation?
We did, from the records that we have, it seems as though it was around 1943 that it was founded as a civil defense unit actually during World War II, and then sort of remained a civil defense unit. And then over time, with changes in state law, as civil defense units started being sort of phased out or converted to other uses, there was sort of a separation at that point. I think, CERT teams and auxiliary police, and at some point, the civil defense unit was converted to an auxiliary police unit, again, the information here is sort of sketchy with the documents going back, in some cases over 50 years, and also being able to talk to certain retired members of the auxiliary or retired members of the Maplewood Police Department and get their recollection. But it seems as though, the force itself goes back in some way, shape, or form nearly 80 years, but has been an auxiliary police force, since at least the 1960s. And from the information we've gathered, it seemed that that's, they were armed at some point, likely during the 1960s or at latest the early 1970s. Because people who served at that time recall having firearms. So I hope that answers your question, but I think you're still on if it didn't.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems like we don't have a lot of really details on that, but I get sort of the point and what you've included in the document. I think as a follow-up with my remaining time on the floor, I would just like to ask, how many times have we actually in the history of this force dating back to the 1940s, have we actually taken a moment to look at how we've evolved the use of what the needs are for the community and what we've been doing to help evolve how we're using this auxiliary force to meet those community needs? Is this the first time? I've only lived here for 5 years.
And again, I think that's a difficult question. It's a good question, but I think it's a difficult one for us to answer because, each of us only goes back so far. I've been on the township committee. This is my 5th year, and I've lived in town for, I guess, about 14 years now. And, I don't recall, an examination like this taking place, a real, a review period, a real investigation like this, going back through the documents, having the public ask questions, having elected officials ask questions, and having community dialogue like this, is unprecedented in my tenure. But, the chief has been, the chief actually grew up here in the community, and the chief has been with us for many decades. Mr. DeLuca has been on the committee long before I have. Ms. Adams has certainly lived in the community for several decades. So I would yield to them if they have any sort of recollections of prior times when, when maybe an inquiry like that or a community discourse like that has taken place, but I'm not aware of one, which doesn't mean it didn't happen. I'm just not aware.
Mr. Lembrich, I was a police auxiliary in 1988, so I can only go from 1988 forward. We were armed in 1988. We had a chain of command, a chief, a rank structure. We participated in similar trainings as they do today. I think over time, what I've noticed most is the town has asked for more duties and responsibilities of our police auxiliary unit. Certainly a lot of the events that we have now, we didn't have back then.
Thanks, Chief. I don't know if Mr. DeLuca or Ms. Adams sort of have any recollection of an earlier time.
This has not come up in my 21 years on the township committee.
Okay. Thanks, and I'm not seeing Ms. Adams jump in, so I think that may be the best we can do in terms of the history. I'm going to go back to the list, and the next person with their hand raised from the public is Beth Boyley. Beth, I'm allowing you to talk now.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks so much, everybody, for this fascinating discussion, actually. I grew up in a town out in Long Island that had auxiliary police and have a lot of memories as a teen of running away from them and all of that teens do. And I have, I asked my 22-year-old daughter for her view on interactions, and her view was she couldn't tell the difference between the auxiliary police and the paid police because their uniforms are so similar. And this brings me to something that Chief jdevaul said back in the beginning, which is if they're wearing the uniform, they need to have the gun because they could easily be mistaken for paid police and be approached in the way that, a no good doer, I guess, would approach a paid police. And so I thought, maybe one of the considerations that we could have is that when auxiliary police are in situations where they maybe don't need arms, like helping out at churches or whatever, that perhaps they could have a different uniform that looks less police-like, and that might help ease that tension. The other thing is that, I know that Chief jdevaul was very specific and said he really didn't know much about the towns that don't have armed auxiliary police, but I believe we do have neighboring towns around Maplewood that have unarmed auxiliary police. I think Orange and East Orange and West Orange are some of them, Milburn. I believe that they all use auxiliary police in similar ways. So I guess my question is, so, all right, I just gave a comment. My only question is, when the auxiliary police are in training, are they always with regular paid police at that time?
Chief?
No, not necessarily. Depends on where they're at in their training. So no, not necessarily. They often work alongside our officers, but they're not exclusively working with my officers.
Okay, thanks, Chief. The next member of the public with their hand raised is Axel Tkach. Mr. Tkach, I'm taking you into talk mode.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much for this. I'll briefly repeat one point that everyone's been making is that auxiliary police are to be deployed armed only in matters of disasters, emergencies, and training. And of course, given that from 2015 to 2019, there were 20,000 hours The response of auxiliary police hours, the response has been consistent. Yes, it's either been disaster emergency, and if it hasn't been, we've been training the whole time. Now, if that's the case, we basically expand the definition of training to whenever the aux police are assigned to do something. Although in the manual, in the law, it dictates, quote, scheduling, auxiliary police officers shall not be used as a substitute for regular or special police officers. Scheduling or extending a period of training to accomplish such result is unlawful. Now, a response to that may be, well, they're not really substituting, they're just doing other duties, but you've just said that they go out on duty by themselves, clearly substituting for what a regular police officer would do. Finally, it says in the manual that if they're not, that they're only allowed to be armed when they're paired with a regular police officer. So that means you're also in violation of the law in that case, if you just said to go out armed by themselves. So how would you address that? And if this is not being addressed, I would highly recommend the township committee actually make an inquiry into the AG to see if we're using these auxiliary police, thank you for their volunteering time, if we're actually using them illegally or not. Thank you.
Chief, can you address that?
I don't know specifically what he's referring to as far as them only being able to ride with the regular police officer. I would have to look further into that. I'm certainly unaware of that.
I'm sorry, Parrot, I've just pasted it in the chat. I don't care. Here, it's in the chat, right? The manual requires that all auxiliary police officers when on assignment required the carrying firearm will be under the supervision of a responsible regular police officer.
That doesn't, okay, well, I don't interpret that as they have to be with them at the time.
So
Like standing next to them.
So we've expanded the definition of training, and now we've expanded the definition of supervision. Once again, you're welcome to do what you wish, but I do think, given all the AG letters in the past in the 80s and 90s, that this needs to be addressed to the AG to see if we're using it correctly. Thank you very much. You can mute me again.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Tkach. We're going to move on to the next member of the public with their hand raised, and that's Lila Gold. Ms. Gold, sorry. There we go. You should be able to talk now.
Hi, my name is Lila Gold, and I just want to say this to address the Public Safety Committee and the Township Committee members that are in this call. Public safety needs to be communal, public, and easily understandable and accessible. The Maplewood Township Committee and Public Safety Committee and Police Force have not made it so. On July 21st, during the Maplewood Township Committee meeting, we all remember so well, the Township Committee members committed to dedicating time to research the history of, the use for, and the arming of the auxiliary force, yet we have seen none of this publicly or otherwise. On July 30th, July 31st, and August 12th, the MAPSA Youth Coalition met with Mr. DeLuca, Mr. Lembrich, and Mr. Daffis, respectively, to discuss the presence and arming of the auxiliary force, among other subjects. During these meetings, the Township Committee members explicitly committed to researching individually and as a group, hosting community forums during September, and releasing and circulating the frequently asked questions document. Though I will give you the benefit of the doubt regarding research, I have not been aware of any learning taking place, and the obvious lack of community forums is very upsetting to see, as the only forum that I was made aware of was the one with senior citizens, and I only learned of it through discussions with others who have done extensive research on this issue. When was the public given the opportunity to give their input? During the July meeting, Mr. Lembrich said that the FAQ document would be released, and this is in quotes, soon. It is now October 14th, 75 days later, and it was released last night. This is unacceptable. Township Committee members all expressed a desire to keep the public informed, and they even received outreach suggestions from the MAPSA Youth Coalition and from other community members. Despite this, the 90-day pause on the auxiliary force ends in 6 days, October 20th, and the majority of people currently living in Maplewood still don't know about the existence of the force, let alone its arming. Many legal and ideological questions remain unanswered, and the township committee still has not fulfilled promises they made to the community. So I just want to make the public aware of this, of the lack of transparency, and I would also like the township committee members who are here and the general public safety committee to address this lack of transparency and I'm wondering how you can commit to making the public aware of specifically the FAQs document within the upcoming week. Thank you.
Thank you. We're certainly doing our best to distribute the FAQ document as widely as possible. We sent an e-blast. We've made it available on the township website. I believe that our town hall staff sent it to the local media. If not, I'll make sure that that's done tomorrow. So that I can't promise that they'll publish it, but we can certainly make them aware of it. And beyond that, anyone who has ideas for how to distribute it is certainly welcome to distribute it. Posting links on social media, email, in any other way. And in terms of transparency and public input, I would say that, we've had a number of people comment in prior public safety meetings, prior township committee meetings. And, we're having this meeting tonight where, where we're giving this opportunity for public comment and public questions. This is an opportunity for people to ask questions directly of the chief of police. And we're obviously going to have public comment at next Tuesday's township committee meeting before any discussion among the township committee and certainly before any votes or decisions. So I guess, I don't mean to deprive any of my colleagues if they want to comment, but, unless someone pipes up quickly, I think we'll move on to the next member of the public. Not seeing or hearing no one, let's go to Olivia Brash, who's the next member of the public with hand raised.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, I would just like to echo Lila in making a statement to all of you on the Public Safety Committee concerning your lack of transparency and community involvement in this conversation on the auxiliary police force. As Lila said, you committed to publishing a comprehensive document clarifying the roles of the auxiliary police force and answering frequently asked questions at the township meeting in July. You have had over 2 months to put this together, yet you waited until last night, a week before the decision to release it. I did not receive a copy of this document from the town, even though you agreed to send it to everyone who emailed you concerning the force in July, as per suggestion by MAPSA Youth Coalition in the meetings that Lila mentioned. Instead, I had to hear about it from other community members, which tells me that this information was not distributed adequately. And to be frank, I don't care what your reasons are for not releasing it until now. I still feel that you failed this community by not doing so. You also committed to public forums that would begin in September. I know that Dean and Greg, the MAPSA Youth Coalition, spoke to you about this specifically, and you both expressed interest in hosting these forums. And same as Lila, I only heard about one of them, which was held specifically for senior citizens. Specifically tonight, you have asked us to limit our public comments to questions for you and push public comment to the end of a meeting you had to have known would last for hours, because these meetings typically do. This is all after a lack of public forums and accessible opportunities for public comment in TC meetings. So what you've been telling us since July is basically, we want to hear your opinions, your full opinions, but not now though. It seems that the only time you have deemed appropriate for all of those affected by the continued arming and existence of the auxiliary police force is at the township meeting at which the decision will be made. These meetings are typically hours long, are entirely virtual, and begin in the evening, meaning that they can run very late. So my questions for you are, what are you doing to connect with all of the members of this community? Are you going out into the town? Are you reaching out in ways that are not virtual? Currently, it appears to me that you are not and do not intend to. This 90-day suspension was supposed to be a community endeavor, and frankly, it was not. You've kept us largely uninformed about your research, your discussions in the forts itself, and I feel this is unacceptable.
Okay. I mean, I will, there's nothing I can say that's going to change your mind. I'll just say that, certainly our ability to do any sort of community forum that's not virtual, that would be in person, has certainly been impacted by the ongoing pandemic. And, there have been very few, if any, public gatherings and events that have been sponsored by the township over the past several months, and including, we haven't done any township committee meetings in person, any public safety committee meetings in person. So, and aside from that, I can say that, I disagree that, with the statement about the transparency of the process. I think the process has been transparent, and I think we're here tonight and we'll be next Tuesday night. Everyone will have an opportunity to have their questions answered and to share their thoughts before we make any decision. And also, I'll say that no decision that we make next Tuesday night is necessarily a final decision for all time. There's the same township committee in the near future, or a different set of township committee members going forward could revisit this issue and make a different decision. So, but in terms of this process, I think it's been transparent. I think there have been some delays and some inability to hold public sessions due to the pandemic and other things that we've had going on. And I apologize if this process hasn't met the standard you would have liked it to. But I think, we're a group of largely volunteers who have a lot of things on our plate, and we're doing the best we can.
Mr.
Lembrich?
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. DeLuca, then Mr. Daffis.
Yeah. I have a different take. I think the two previous speakers are correct. I think we did not have a robust discussion of this. We're all to blame on the township committee because we all could have taken up the responsibility to do it, but we just didn't. We didn't do it formally at our meetings. We didn't do it informally. And so I think we have to take ownership of that. I think there's still time to have this conversation. We'll do what we can between now and Tuesday to get information out there. I think the document that was provided last night is very helpful, but it should have been done earlier. We should have had some more meetings. So I agree with them.
Mr. Daffis, did you want to speak?
Yes, I want to echo what Mr. DeLuca said. I think it's fair to apologize here, and I think it's the right thing to do. There were delays, and sometimes delays are inevitable, but we did not keep our promises. We said we were going to have a forum in September. It didn't happen, and the information that was released, it was delayed. And I especially want to personally apologize to MAPSO Youth Coalition because, as Olivia and Layla stated tonight, they did go out of their way to meet with yourself and myself, Mr. Lembrich, and with Mayor McGehee at some point. So, and we made the promise there that we would provide robust opportunity for public discussion. And while we're doing it now, it's not necessarily robust, and we could have done more. And who knows what happens on Tuesday? We don't necessarily have to come to a discussion on Tuesday if the community feels that more discussion is necessary. This is community driven. This is a community issue, and it should be driven by the community in the most appropriate, transparent, and collective manner. So again, I want to personally apologize for our failures and not meeting some of our promises here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daffis. The next member of the public with their hand raised is Heather Seslovsky.
Given that my time's limited and I have a number of questions, I'm just going to run through my questions and then let you answer them as you will. My first question is what Chief jdevaul's definition of an emergency is. My second is that I'm really thrilled that there have been tens of thousands of training hours for emergencies, and we're living in an emergency right now. So I'd like to know why, in fact, the auxiliary was put on hiatus when the emergency actually began. My third question is for the township administrator, which is, does our insurance cover tort claims and 1983 claims? My fourth question is, what officers have trained the auxiliary to direct traffic each Sunday? My fifth question requires me to read something, so hold on a second. On December 22nd, 1992, the AG wrote the following: all training must be bona fide and will not be abused as to the extent. Do you believe that you are in fact abusing this training, as you call it? Additionally, that was in response to, over the past several months, this office has received several requests for information pertaining to, quote, on the job, end quote, training of auxiliary police. Given that the AG letter makes this pretty clear, I would also like to know if Mayor McGehee authorized all of these trainings, because this letter also says that all training must be approved by the mayor. And my sixth question, because Mr. Lembrich hasn't answered it when I asked it privately, although I know he intended to, was the auxiliary included in the autism training conducted by Chilton Specialized Hospital? Thank you.
Mr. Lembrich, there's a lot of questions there. Can we get those in writing? I mean, it's late. Honestly, it's like a lot of questions.
I have a few of them. I took notes. The first was whether how the chief defines the term emergency.
Chief, do you want to answer?
I think that's a very fluid question. I think it's based on the manpower that we have at the time. I think it's based on the circumstances of the event, whether it be weather related or other. I think it's based on what I feel the long-term needs of a particular circumstance is. So I think that's a fluid. I don't think it's clearly defined as one thing or another.
Okay, the next question was why, when there's an emergency ongoing, was the police auxiliary put on hiatus this year? And I think that was a vote of the township committee. That wasn't a decision by you, Chief. Is that correct?
That's correct. I'd have them out there now.
And that is
Okay.
That was our decision, and we made that decision because based on the groundswell, if you will, of the same people who are talking tonight, who wanted us to immediately defund and de-arm the auxiliary, that we felt it was too early to do that and to take our time. So that's the answer.
The next question was, and this may be a question for Ms. Viveros, does the township's insurance policy cover tort and 1983 actions?
The township does, there is coverage for tort claims. I'd have to get some clarification on 1983.
Okay. The next question I took down in my notes was, who trained the officers to direct traffic? Chief, is that something you can address? Is that part of the academy, or is that something there?
Yeah, no, the question sounded very, I think she said something, it sounded very specific, so I wouldn't have a name to an officer who does that. But yes, they are taught traffic control in the academy and then reinforced throughout their training.
Okay. The next question I took down was, the 1992 Attorney General letter that said, training is not to be abused. And do you feel that the way we use the auxiliary police abuses training?
Not at all. We carefully watch that. Our unions do as well. Our unions don't want our reserve officers taking time away that would be rightfully theirs. So we carefully monitor that they're not doing that they're not replacing our regular officers.
Okay. The next question I took down was whether Mayor McGehee had authorized the training. I don't want to speak for the mayor.
I will answer that question. I may not authorize the training, but my chief authorizes the training.
Okay, and the last question, and this is one that I apologize, Ms. Sislavsky. I did mean to ask this, and I forgot. So my bad. I apologize. And Chief, I don't know if you know this, but were the auxiliary part of the autism training that was done for the police department?
If it was well, only thing I could say is I specifically don't recall, but because I remember we did more than one training for autism, and if this was the one in 19, I would say probably yes, but I would have to look at the training records to know for sure. But we did that as well in 20, where they were not involved because they were deactivated.
Okay, thanks, Chief. I think that got all of the questions, or at least that got 7 of them. So we're going to move on. The next person with their hand raised is Jordan Muhammad. You may have to take yourself off mute. Jordan? I'm not hearing Jordan, so maybe we'll try to come back and we'll go to the next one. The next person with their hand raised is Katie Ehlinger.
Hello, thank you. So this question is related to the reference to the auxiliary police SOP 4B9 question that was brought up earlier. So as a result of the information in this discussion tonight, we've learned that all of the auxiliary force are always armed while they're on duty because they're always in training, and they're often on duty alone. This past June, in response to the murder of George Floyd, Chief jdevaul committed to all officers on patrol having body cameras, but auxiliary officers are not outfitted with body cameras. So why has the decision been made to send armed individuals who are representing Maplewood law enforcement out into the community unsupervised and without the oversight of body cameras, if they are, as the chief has stated, never fully trained, but armed?
Chief, I'll let you address that, but I believe that, you know, the commitment to the body cameras was actually made at a time when the program was on hiatus, and they haven't returned yet. So, but, you know, Chief, if you can maybe, since it was your remark, maybe you can clarify that and walk us through the body camera issue.
So the use of body cameras is not required by the Attorney General. So I'll begin with that. Our department has decided to utilize body cameras, and we do so. That's gone on for roughly the past 4 years.
Yes.
So things do progress, and we'll see. I assume that at some point that may be where we go with this. But as far as them being unsupervised, I'm not sure how the body camera and being unsupervised go together. Our officers only recently went to body cameras. There's many other agencies, including neighboring towns, that don't use body cameras. And I'm assuming that if our auxiliaries move forward, I'm assuming that they will have body cameras.
Well, I guess my understanding is the use of body cameras is as much for the safety of and oversight of your officers as it is for the safety and oversight of members of the community. So I applaud the Maplewood PD for wanting to give that extra layer of protection to their officers when they are out on duty. If the auxiliary force were to be put back on duty armed, would you not extend that same protection to them?
Well, you know, the answer to that is going to be in the decision that our township committee makes, but absolutely I'll make that available to them.
Okay, Thank you, Chief. We're gonna move on. The next person with their hand raised from the public was Joyce Lundy.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thanks. So I have like a few short questions, and I'm wondering if I could just ask the question and then have an answer if anyone has one, and then I'll ask the next question. So the first question is, what percentage of arrests in the previous calendar year have been made by auxiliary officers?
0.
And then what, if any, incentives exist for folks to serve on the auxiliary force?
I mean, that's subjective. People serve for volunteer for different reasons.
Are there any tangible and concrete incentives?
No.
Chief, don't we give them some kind of discount at the pool?
If you did, Mr. DeLuca, I was unaware of that.
Okay.
Yeah, I can find out about that, Mr. DeLuca. I think that I don't know where that's. I know that was true in the past. I don't know if that's still true, but I'll find out.
Yeah, I know we did it for the. I thought we did it for the first aid squad and the auxiliary, but I'm not sure. You can check that. That would be the only thing.
I'll find out if that's still the case.
And then I also heard that you said that the trainings that you experienced, Chief, in the 80s were similar to the trainings that happen currently. And a question that's coming up for me is, if the auxiliary force is supposed to support emergencies, and the nature of emergencies that we've experienced over the past decade or two have evolved greatly, like, for example, the Twin Towers, you know, natural disasters hitting New Jersey, likes of which the state hasn't seen in decades. I'm wondering, why would the training be the same if the function is supposed to be for them to support the community in times of disaster?
Well, certain trainings are the same, like I indicated from you know, there are mandatory trainings that they go through, such as the powers of arrest, use of force, first aid has to be updated constantly. We're required to. Title 39, which is motor vehicle law enforcement, that changes constantly. You know, the laws change every year, and the applications of the laws, as far as responding to emergencies such as weather events, they change as well. But for the most part, those are the kinds of things. Weather-related events are the kinds of things that stay the same. Crowd control issues, those things, we train differently in them as the years go on. We learn, you know, different tactics. You know, so how you train for one thing in the 80s is not how you train for something in 2020.
Mm-hmm. And then my last question, which has already been raised in some way already, but wasn't raised as a question. You know, you expressed concern for auxiliary officers donning uniforms and not carrying weapons. And I'm wondering if there's a fear that the auxiliary officers will be misconstrued for regular officers. Why not create a greater distinction between the two in terms of the attire that we're offering them? And I also just want to point out that at any point, any of us could come under fire. You know, children, unfortunately, have come under fire simply trying to attend school in this country. So I'm concerned that the public is being asked to accept an undue risk to protect volunteer officers rather than taking additional precautions. So I'm wondering, would you be willing to create greater distinctions in the uniforms and attire for the two different forces?
Okay. So a couple things that you asked there. And firstly, they are authorized to enforce the same laws as our police officers are when they're on duty. So there's no distinguishment with the fact that they can make arrests, use force, conduct traffic stops, have arrest powers. So they have the same abilities that our regular officers do. And as far as distinguishing the officers between them, actually, the thing about that is most people recognize a uniform and they don't recognize the differences. If I put a Maplewood police officer next to a reserve officer, they are very different. Our auxiliaries it's I forget the shade of blue, but it's like a light blue shirt. Our officers wear navy blue pants and shirts. So right away, you notice the different color and shirt. The pants are very different. The pants for auxiliaries have a yellow stripe on them, and our officers do not have any stripe on them whatsoever. Our auxiliary officers have a different badge style. So there's very if you put them side by side, you'd realize, oh wow, they are different. But most people just see a uniform. So when somebody said before, you know, you don't know the officers and you don't know the differences, it's just because you're basically not looking that closely, and most people aren't. They see a uniform and they assume that it's a police officer. Actually, our auxiliary officers' uniforms more look like other towns, such as Nutley, but they don't look anything like our Maplewood police officers. You know, I mean, beyond the badge, if you look at the badge, then you're not looking at a different color shirt and a stripe on the pants.
Okay, thank you, Chief. The next member of the public with their hand raised is Kim Takach. Kim, you may need to take yourself off mute.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Okay, great. So this question is for Chief jdevaul. You mentioned and spoke earlier about how there are local towns that some choose to have auxiliary, some choose to arm the auxiliary, and others do not. And I fully recognize you don't have the details of everything that's going on in other departments in other towns. And then it's up to the chief of the town to decide how to utilize or whether or not to have the auxiliary. But I have been doing some research, and I know that only 13% of Essex County police departments have armed auxiliary police, and only 10% of Union County police departments have armed aux, and none, so 0% of the police departments in Middlesex County have armed auxiliary. And I do know that in some local towns, the auxiliary are going on ride-alongs unarmed and doing a lot of the same duties that our auxiliary do, and doing them unarmed. So my question for you then is, what is it about our town, our community, that makes you feel, it's your choice to, whether or not to have an aux or to arm them? What is it that's special about Maplewood that makes you feel like this is a necessary component of our police department?
So I don't make that decision as the chief. When I became chief, I became the person who was assigned to run and manage this unit. I didn't authorize it. It's authorized by the township committee. I didn't authorize the carrying of the weapons. In 1988, when I joined the auxiliary, I was authorized to carry a weapon. So those aren't things that I authorize. But my responsibility in this is to manage them. And as far as anything else, I let the township committee decide whether they're going to be armed or not be armed. They tell me what they want. They tell me, meaning the township committee decides a lot of what they want their duties and responsibilities to be, and I manage it that way. If they remove duties or responsibilities, then I'll have to adapt with that. But I'm managing the group that I have now, asking them to do the things that we've asked them to do. So I believe that that's my role in this.
Chief, I'm going to push back on you a little bit on that. We count on your expertise and your leadership on this as to guiding us, since
Absolutely.
none of us is a police officer. So
yes, absolutely. I find that that's my role. I do guide the township committee the best way I can to ask them or to advise the committee as what the needs are for our community. They make the ultimate decision.
Right, okay, that's not what I just heard you say.
Yes.
Right.
Okay, so, and Chief, so you are providing guidance to us and, putting aside whatever guidance may have been provided by chiefs in the past, yourself included, and your predecessors. At this point, the Township Committee is certainly looking to you for guidance on this. And the question was asked, why should the Maplewood officers be armed? You're putting aside, that maybe other towns aren't. The question that I think Ms. Tkach put to you was, was why, putting aside whether it's the Township Committee or you who makes the decision.
Right.
As Ms. Adams just pointed out, we look to you, as our Chief of Police, as our top law enforcement officer for guidance on this issue. So what is your guidance to us, and what is the reason for that? Why, if you think the Maplewood Auxiliary Police should be armed, why is that?
We've given our Maplewood officers the authority to make arrests. We've given our Maplewood Auxiliary during times of emergency and training, of course. But we've trained our officers to use force. We've trained our officers to administer first aid, to do crowd control, to handcuff arrested individuals. So we've asked them to be police officers during the times of an emergency. We've trained them to be police officers during the time of emergency. So it is necessary for our auxiliaries to carry a weapon to effectuate arrests, which they are authorized to do during an emergency. Our officers need to be equipped to do the things that we have trained them to do and asked them to do.
Okay. Thank you, Chief. The next member of the public with their hand raised is Khadijah White. Dr. White, you're on.
Good evening to everyone. You can hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. Thanks. Vic, the first thing I wanted to say was that, Vic, I kind of interrupted you inadvertently. I interrupted you before when you were asking about what unarmed aux units do, so that we can think about how to use an unarmed unit. And as Kim referenced, we have a long list of which aux groups in New Jersey are unarmed, and we could share it. I think that's actually the majority model of the state. I posted to the chat like kind of a broad plea to open up public comment, but I didn't mean for it to overlap with your comments, so I apologize for that. I'm gonna put aside the fact that the way our aux police are operating seems pretty shady under the law and existing state legal guidance, and that we can't seem to find in our research or in the documents that you provided that the aux was ever really legally armed by our township, since they carried guns long before 1988, and we can't find a clear town resolution on this. I'm gonna put aside all of the kind of legal shadiness here, but I will say that it seems to me everything cannot be training. The law wouldn't specify training and emergency if everything was literally training and an emergency. So I feel like there needs to be kind of a better effort for the town and the police chief even to really kind of think through what is training, what is an emergency. I understand that a lot of this comes down to personal philosophy. The police chief thinks that anybody who does something connected to police duties should be armed. At the same time, we open up this meeting talking about social workers being embedded in police. I don't think we think they should be armed. I don't think we think EMTs need to be armed. So, I mean, obviously, we can think about the aux differently, right? It's not just about their duties and responsibilities. But again, I'm trying to put all that aside. I'm actually, is Ms. Adams still on the call?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, hi. I actually kind of wanted to appeal, I think, to Vic and to Mr. DeLuca and to Ms. Adams. I pass Mr. DeLuca's Black Lives Matter sign every day. Ms. Adams, I know you from the community and your work in advocating for women, and a lot of what I've been doing personally around this has been about Breonna Taylor. It's been about the fact that she was murdered in her bed, that she wanted to have kids, that she wanted to be a nurse. I think a lot of people run for elected office because of history, because we look up to people who took stances that were hard, that were unpopular. And I'm telling you, Mr. DeLuca, I'm telling you, Ms. Adams, this is when you step up. This is when you choose to stand with people who are telling you that they are afraid every time they leave their house. Both of my children are larger than average. When I was stopped in a park near my apartment in South Orange as a child here with my friends and had a spotlight from the police pointed at me, they asked me, where do you live? 16 years later, when I moved back here as a Maplewood resident, I was pulled over by a Maplewood police officer and I was asked the very same question. Not all of my family who visits me here is from Maplewood. So this is very concerning to me. I know the police are difficult. I know they often decide elections. I've watched the Fraternal Order of Police literally destroy careers, but that is what makes this a powerful choice, Ms. Adams and Mr. DeLuca. That is what makes listening to the community, to thinking about what Breonna means, important. If you give guns to people with less experience, you have to think about how they might be used. A lot of folks who really support and defend police department officers look at what happened to Breonna Taylor and they say that's not a big deal because that's not what most cops do, right? That most cops are good apples, but what we're asking you to think about are the bad apples. We're asking you to think about mistakes that might happen because that is what I think about every single day. So that's a plea, and I hope that you're listening.
Thank you, Dr. White. The next member of the public with their hand raised is Dennis Kearney or Kearney.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Mr. Lembrich, you mentioned earlier in response to an earlier question that, while the township hasn't been in direct consultation with the Attorney General's office, that you work closely with municipal council. So I just had kind of a follow-up on that. It sounds like there's some agreement broadly about, that auxiliary officers can only carry firearms in emergencies and in training for such emergencies. And it seems like the disconnect is kind of like what's training and what's not training. So on this particular issue, has municipal council weighed in on this idea that, the Attorney General would have made a bulleted list with 2 exclusionary times when officers can be armed if one of those 2 things was meant to be all inclusive of everything that an auxiliary officer would do, and if there's you've gotten sort of legal sign off on that's a reasonable interpretation to make, that everything that an auxiliary officer does is by definition training.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't want to speak for Mr. Desiderio. I know that the chief and I spoke with him, and he didn't. He looked this over, and he didn't express concerns. And the chief can weigh in if he has a different recollection of the discussion. But I don't want to state a legal opinion. Nor do I want to speak for our township attorney. Our township attorney will certainly be present at the township committee meeting next Tuesday evening, where this is going to continue to be discussed. And I think that whether from the township committee or the public, it would be appropriate for legal questions to be addressed to him. I mean, some of us are lawyers by training, myself, Mr. Daffis, maybe a few others on the call, but this is pretty far outside my area of legal expertise. And I am not the township attorney, so I don't want to speak for him.
Okay, I was just following up because you had said that you had been working in consultation, so I wasn't sure if you got specific advice on that. I'm not an attorney, but to me as a layperson, it seems to me that if you make an exclusive list of conditions that must be met to do something, that there must be something that would be excluded from that list, and I haven't heard anything yet today. So I look forward to hearing that on Tuesday.
Okay, thank you. The next person with their hand raised is Gwen Kay.
Hi. So I have two questions. One, what are the recruitment practices for this auxiliary unit? How do you recruit these people?
Chief, can you speak to that?
Generally speaking, our reserves are at our public events. We have the information on our police department website with regards to volunteering and signing up for the reserves, but generally it's at our township events.
Okay, thanks. And second question, do you have, I guess, what would you, I mean, total conjecture, but do you think that if you were to unarm the auxiliary police, that there would be, you would have less volunteers as a result? Are you concerned about that?
No, that's not my concern. I think just the scope of their duties would change. People are either going to volunteer or they're not. I mean, maybe as the end, maybe you know, as a aside to all of this, we get more volunteers. I don't know. I can't say yet. We'll have to see.
What is your concern?
I don't necessarily have a concern. I need to get clear direction on what our expectations are going to be moving forward for our unit. So as of today, you know, all things considered, they still have authority and powers to arrest. I can't say whether they're going to have that, you know.
But they don't arrest, right? So they're not, but they haven't been.
Wait a minute. Powers to arrest and the ability to arrest and making an arrest are very different things.
How does it happen that they have the power to arrest, but they haven't arrested in the last year? I'm just curious about that.
I don't have an answer for that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. The next person with their hand raised is Aaron Scherzer. So Aaron, I think you can probably take yourself off mute.
Hi, I have a question, having sat through this entire meeting, now going 4 minutes to midnight. And I'm going to say this, and I hope you trust that I'm asking this with incredible respect for all of you that I've personally worked with. Where's the fire and why we're rushing to make this decision so soon? I hear, and I keep coming back to the comments from Lila and Olivia about the fact that there were supposed to be public forums. It seems like there's just this back and forth, almost semi-deposition style with questions. And is there a specific time frame that the township is working under? I reflect on all the work that you guys have done over the years and other initiatives, from the plastic bag initiative to the creation of the community board on police to even the Wi-Fi initiative, where it's been worked out over months, in some cases years, before it actually came into place. And if we're really trying to protect the public, and actually a part of that public is the auxiliary officers that have served for decades, I feel like we owe more time, careful thought, and more collaboration in how this will be. So I guess my question in essence simply is there a time frame that you're under, and can we push this out a little bit?
So I'll take that one, Mr. Lembrich. We set this time frame because of simply the demand of the public. The public wanted us to take these individuals, these auxiliary police officers, off the street because they had guns. That was that, and there was no time, frankly, to make a decision either way to keep them on or to not. So we needed time. I'm not going to comment on the meetings and all that, because I never met with the Maps Youth Coalition. I reached out to them several times, and I couldn't accommodate to their schedule. So that, for the record, I reached out to them. They never reciprocated. That being said, I think that, as Mr. Lembrich said, and I agree with him on this, that, we're volunteers. We have full-time jobs, we have families, and we're doing the very best we can. and we're trying to come up with a thoughtful decision. And there's a lot of documents we've looked at. I mean, personally, I've been on Zoom now I started with the 7 o'clock. I've been on Zoom now for 5 hours, not to mention the 8 o'clock meeting I did this morning. So just today alone, I've spent 6 hours dedicated to this township. And I think every one of my colleagues, including our township administrator and our chiefs, are dedicated to this township.
And Frank, and Mayor,
let me finish.
Yes.
So, you know, if my colleagues want to extend this out further, then we'll discuss that on Tuesday. I'm okay with that. But, you know, as Mr. Lembrich said, you know, we've heard a lot. I think my emails are up to 326 from people regarding this issue, and I've read nearly all of them, and I've replied to a lot of them. You know, so I think we've been responsive, we've been transparent, we've been open. I feel that way, and if my colleagues disagree, they can disagree. But at this point, if we want to extend this process some more, I'm fine with it. Honestly, you know, I think that our chairperson is being respectful because we have 10 more people at average of 3 minutes a clip. We'll be here till 1 a.m. Okay? So, you know, so I'm just going to set it straight. You know, I've already made my decision, but I'm trying to be respectful to my colleagues in the process. If you ask me for my decision, I can tell you right now where I want to go. I'm not going to say it because I'm being respectful to the process. All right. So we can talk about extending it if we want, but also we're also putting our chief in a bind, you know, frankly, because he does need those officers. And theoretically, one of the things happens that impacts our OT. And we've been very lucky, you know, but that does impact OT as well. So I just think we need a little bit of clarity and level, you know, and brevity here, what's going on. You know, these officers, you know, have been very loyal to our township. They are, for the most part, the ones that I know have been outstanding. When you read the procedures in terms of if you were to use a firearm, you know, the procedures are ironclad. Their work is ironclad. You know, their details are ironclad. So, you know, for us to make a decision to disarm them, which may be the case, you know, they're casualties of the climate. But that being said, we do need to reimagine how we police, and that's what we're talking about. But I take pause when people want to sit here and criticize me and my colleagues for the work we put towards this township. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I think Greg, Mr. Lembrich, I had more time. I only asked a 45-second question.
Aaron, I think you have 2 minutes left, so go ahead.
Thank you. I was not critiquing any of you as individuals. I was asking a question about the process. And like you, and like all of you on the call, I'm also a volunteer in the community that spends significant amount of time toward the community to be able to make things better. So I think what we have to, the question more comes from the views of the public that they felt that their voice wasn't heard. And if the town has a process and the process is the process, then that's fine. But my question is there a sense of urgency? It sounds like there was a timeline set, potentially negotiable, potentially changeable. I'm just reflecting on the other steps that the town has taken to be very thoughtful in processes and trying to do things right and collaboratively together. That's all.
Thank you, Ms. Scherzer. And I'll just, you know, I'll try to address your question, you know, as you know, from my perspective, and that's that, you know, we set the 90-day time frame back in July, and the 90 days is coming up, and you know, there was no particular magic to that date. You know, we could have set it for 100 days or 120 or 50, but we set it at 90. So, you know, it's on for discussion next Tuesday night. And, you know, certainly one of the options that the Township Committee might consider is not making a decision that night, or, you know, or making a decision to extend the hiatus. You know, I'll just say that one of the distinctions from my perspective between this period and, you know, some of the other periods you mentioned is that, you know, we actually have a group of a dozen or more officers who are currently keeping up their training obligations, keeping up their firearm qualification. But now for, you know, between COVID and this suspension, or now, you know, have now basically been on hiatus for most of 2020. And I think, we'd like to make a decision. The chief, as the mayor said, would like to have these folks available, particularly in times of emergency, such as a storm or other event. So for me, I would like to move forward on this, and for as much as I try to be as transparent as possible and try to make processes as open as possible and make things accessible to the public. I think there comes a point where, the 5 members of the township committee, as the elected officials, have to make a decision. And, and whether that's next Tuesday or not, I think ultimately, we can't punt this decision, down the road forever. So, we're going to have to make a decision. And I think if people are prepared to make a decision next Tuesday, that's the deadline we set. We'll do that. I like the mayor. I think I'm ready to make my decision. And, at the end of the day, this form of government is one that, as the public has their say on each issue, but then really the public has their say come election time when they elect the 5 people who get to vote. And the 5 people who make this decision, where the decision is made next week or next month or even next year, I suspect have already been elected.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, Aaron, I just want to apologize to you. It's, please don't take anything I said personally. I just feel like, honestly, that I take offense when people criticize my colleagues for the amount of work that they put in for this town. So I just, so nothing against you, you're a dear friend of mine, but I just feel like that regardless of how people perceive transparency or not, I can say that the 4 of my colleagues have really worked hard on this initiative and so many others, especially this year. They've worked tirelessly. And so, and they're gonna make thoughtful decisions, and they've already done their research, and they're trying to be, open to conversations, and we're also appreciative of the efforts that our committee, that our residents have made as well. But we live in a community that's unique, and at the end of the day, we're not like other communities, even in Essex County or any other place in our country, but we are being impacted by the climate of our country, and that's evident in these conversations we're having this evening. But again, I just want to communicate clearly that A, I apologize to you, Aaron, and B, that I support these 4 individuals and the hard work they've done, and also the work of our township administrator and our chief and deputy chief, who are also here with us as well. All of the individuals on the screens in front of you are committed to the greater good of this town. And so I just want to make sure that that's in the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Aaron Scherzer. It looks like we have Jordan Muhammad back, who I'd called on earlier. I'm going to open up her mic. She might need to take herself off mute.
Yeah, thank you for that, Committee Member Greg. Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, at this point, I don't have much to say in my statement. I would like to respond to Mayor McGee's response to MAPSA Youth Coalition. We actually did, the problem was that you wanted to meet in person, and that didn't work for many of our committee members. There was vacations, and we did ask for a Zoom meeting or an in-person meeting, and we did not get a response. Bridges are burned. We're okay now.
I disagree with that, Jordan. And I saw you this summer. I saw you this summer. So, listen, I was proactive, reaching out to you both, or whoever the emails were. So there's no bridges burned. But I just want to be clear that I offered to meet, and it was schedules of other folks that didn't fit for them. So that's why we didn't meet. But you did meet with other colleagues of mine, which I think is great. So just to be clear, thank you.
The last email, though, was Lila saying that we could either, can we meet in person or on Zoom? And we did not get a response. She just checked the email.
I said we would meet in person, just like you did with another one.
It's after midnight. Can we not go back and forth on this? Like, suffice to say that you never met? I never met with MAPSO Youth either. So Jordan, can you just go to the comments regarding this issue?
Yep, I'm just going to quickly echo Aaron. I think Greg's statement regarding the ideas that you guys are elected, and in the end, it doesn't seem like our perspectives matter as much because you guys get to do kind of what your opinions are once you guys are elected. We know that's kind of the system that is, but we don't necessarily agree that that makes sense considering this is a community and the community should have an input on what decisions are made. And considering that you guys did not make a significant amount of effort to include the community in conversation, whether or not you decide to extend the decision, but whatever actions you guys decide to take in the future, we strongly urge you that you make a greater effort to include the community in that conversation. It should be a problem that the majority of community members did not even know the auxiliary police force existed. This is just a problem of knowledge. And as town council members, yes, you do have more knowledge than us. Yes, you do have this authority position we gave you, but you should also make an effort to include us. And we do hope that you keep that in mind in this coming week and in the future as your tenure, considering that you will likely be reelected.
Thank you, Ms. Mohammed. The next person with their hand raised from the public is Tony Ann Cruz.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Great. Thank you all for taking the time tonight. And thank you, Chief jdevaul, for answering all of our many questions. I guess for me, I still am having a problem with like a gating issue for myself, which is that I'm not really seeing much legal authority that says that there was ever an act to arm the Maplewood Police. So I see in the standard operating procedures manual that was produced last night, this reference to the 1988 statute, or the 1988 resolution, sorry. We have a copy of the 1988 resolution, and the statute that it refers to says nothing about the police being armed. And so, you know, I feel that that's kind of a major point that's been glossed over in terms of the discussion, just that, you know, we're kind of assuming that, well, they've always been armed and so they're armed and they must be legally armed. And I hope that this discussion with the town attorney like goes a little bit further, because I do think that there are some questions there. And I know, Chief jdevaul, you said you joined the auxiliary in 1988. Do you know if they were armed before? Because I suspect that they were, but I'm just curious if you have any knowledge of, you know, whether the arming of the auxiliary predates that resolution.
My furthest historical context, just by speaking with other members and seeing some very old photos, was as indicated in the as far back to as the late 60s, maybe early 70s.
Okay. So yeah, so I mean, that's just something that I'm very curious about, and I keep coming back to, quite frankly, because I feel like it's a major gating issue. And then I guess following up on one of the earlier questions, you know, there seems to be a lot of concern about not having the auxiliary armed if they have arrest powers. But you had mentioned that they've never arrested anyone. So I'm wondering, you know, if that's because they're paired with a full-time police officer, and so the arrest goes under the name of the full-time police officer. And so if that's the case, do you have any records of how many people have been apprehended by auxiliary police officers? So maybe the arrest wasn't done by that person, but they were apprehended by an auxiliary officer?
And Chief, just to clarify, I think maybe what's being confusing to the public and now myself here is, before when you said 0 arrests by auxiliary officers, was that just for the year 2020, or was that going back further than that? Maybe you can clarify that, because, you know, if clarifying it doesn't answer the question that was just asked, we'll come back to that question. But
I believe the question
I'm confused too.
Yeah, I believe the question that was asked at the time was there any arrests in 2020? So that's what I had answered.
Okay, well, that makes sense. They haven't been on duty for much of 2020 anyway, but yeah, okay, so that
Okay,
makes
so, and you know, so Chief, you know, did they, you know, and again, I know you probably don't necessarily have statistics, you know, at your fingertips on this, but, you know, are you aware of arrests that were made in 2019 or earlier years by auxiliary officers?
No, I'm unaware. I wasn't asked to provide that data, so I didn't run arrests by auxiliaries.
Okay,
I was asked about use
is
of
that
force.
sorry, Chief, is that data that you would be able to get for us?
Sure.
Okay. So yeah, I think that's probably a good step. You know, since we hadn't collected that data, Chief, if you can, you know, you or someone else in your office could maybe run and just see if, you know, just run through the arrest records and see if there's any for, you know, for the auxiliary. And, you know, if not, you know, maybe there may be, you know, an explanation like, I believe it was Ms. Cruz just suggested, you know, that maybe it was a full-time officer that, you know, either was already there or maybe provided backup who officially made the arrest. But I think that's a good question.
Well,
and
and
yeah,
it's,
I'd like to find out the answer.
yeah, I also think that information would be very important when you're trying to decide whether taking away arrest powers, if that's necessary, if we make the assumption that taking away arrest powers is a necessary thing to disarming the auxiliary police, then, you know, having that quantitative, you know, understanding of how much of their job is actually arresting folks, like whether that really matters or not. So, you know, I mean, it sounds like most people have already made up their minds, so I don't know how much it matters at all, but I do think it would be interesting to know.
I think it sounds like that's information we can get.
Okay, great. I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. The next member of the public with their hand raised is Nicholas Carbonara. And Nicholas, it looks like you're on mute, so you have to take yourself off.
Apologies for that. I just did so now. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. Yep.
Great, thank you. So I realize it's pretty late, so I'll just keep this brief. Essentially, just what I want to clarify is something I think a lot of people have been getting at, which is the definitions of words like emergency, of words like training, and so on and so forth. So particularly with regards to the word training, is there any kind of precedent for essentially like what person's laws or documents would establish what qualifies as training as set forth in these legal documents? Or is that kind of left ambiguous? Essentially, who decides the definition of that word? Or what document?
Chief, I don't know if you can answer that. I mean, that, to the extent it's a legal question, that, to be honest, Mr. Carbonaro, that may be a more appropriate question for our township attorney, Mr. Desiderio, who will be present at the meeting on Tuesday, the township committee meeting. He's not here this evening. Chief, if you can answer that, go ahead. But yeah, Mr. Carbonaro, to the extent you're looking for a legal answer, I think we're probably going to have to defer to the township attorney on that.
Got it. And would the same apply for like terms like emergency, like kind of like when, essentially just to like determine when auxiliary officers are qualified to be active and armed?
Well, I mean, I think some of these terms are actually defined in the, either in the statutes or in these documents. To the extent they're not, I can't speak to the legal definition, and I don't want to speak for the chief, but I doubt he could either. These really might be questions, better put to the township attorney. And I'll try to make him aware of these questions in advance of Tuesday's meeting. But I don't know that we're going to be able to give you a more satisfactory or complete answer tonight.
Okay, thank you. And again, just kind of the main reason I bring it up is because kind of like words like this, they seem to have like sort of a lot of import kind of for this discussion. And it's sort of troubling to me that kind of at the moment they can be sort of like flexed and interpreted by whoever happens to be like trying to consider these words at the given time, be they in charge of the auxiliary or somewhere else in the process. So that's just why I want to raise that concern. And thank you. I appreciate your answer.
Okay, thank you. The next person from the public with their hand raised is Beverly Aubrey.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
It's late, guys. Thank you for the work you're doing. You know, I always thought Maplewood had a great record on public safety, but now I've learned that we're one of the few towns in Essex County, even Union County, that has an auxiliary police that carries guns. I mean, all these communities, Cranford, Elizabeth, Summit, Westfield, Bloomfield, East Orange, Newark, Nutley, Roseland, West Orange, Irvington, Milburn, South Orange. Well, they don't have an armed auxiliary. So I'm wondering, do we have more crime here? Is that why our people have to carry guns?
Well, Chief, I can let you answer that. I think the answer in terms of crime rate, depends on what community you're comparing us to. But compared to at least a number of the communities you just mentioned, our crime rate is lower. But a number of the communities that you mentioned, while some do have auxiliary police forces, a number of them don't. So it's not that they have some of those communities, it's not that they have an unarmed auxiliary. Some of them just don't have an auxiliary police force. For example, South Orange, doesn't have an auxiliary police force. So, Chief, is there anything you can add to that?
Well, I don't believe that there's a correlation between the amount of crime we have in Maplewood and to whether they're armed or not.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Again, I think that this goes back to the job that we're asking them to do, and just like our own officers, and throughout my career, we've certainly had time when our crime was much higher, and then now we're going through a period where the crime is much lower. I don't think the decision to make whether there's going to be an emergency or the necessity to have a weapon is dictated by whether the crime is low or not.
Okay. Ms. Aubrey, do you have another question?
Not at 12:20 tonight. Thank you.
Understood and appreciated. Thank you. Have a good night. We are now going to go, the next member of the public with their hand raised is Doreen O.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm awake, but my Wi-Fi keeps dozing off, so if you can't hear me, let me know.
We hear you loud and clear.
So it's Doreen Oliver, and I just wanted to thank you all for this. And I also want to say that I have found Chief jdevaul and Deputy Chief Sally to be very engaged with the community and very straightforward. So I appreciate that in general and specifically in this discussion. I do a parent. Well, I am African American. I have African American children. I have a child with autism. So I personally prefer not to have more guns in the street, considering that children of color and developmentally disabled individuals are often disproportionately have force used against them. But specifically regarding this conversation, there's a couple points that I wanted to make. Number one, I don't know how a final decision can be made about such a critical issue without talking to towns or cities that do have auxiliary forces that are not armed. I don't understand how we can make a decision without consulting them, without doing our due diligence on that. So that is a critical point of investigation, I believe. And I think it's also worth reaching out to the AG regarding the legality of this. Many people have made this point already. I don't need to reinforce it. I can appreciate you don't want the auxiliary force to be armed if they're not in uniform. And I will reiterate what other people have said about making it distinctive. And I understand, Chief jdevaul, your point about some people, it may be distinctive to you, but to the larger community, it's not distinctive. So maybe there is something else that can be addressed with regard to the tire. And, you know, personally speaking, I do appreciate Chief duvall's ability to engage, but quite honestly, on the last meeting that I was on with the town council, discussion we had about this in July, the leadership of the auxiliary committee was not as open, and it was not as engaged, and it was not as interested in a discussion. And quite honestly, at the time, there were points made that made it seem like the community at large were in fact what the police officers needed to defend themselves. Personal affront to that. So that leadership concerns me. And I also, again, this point has been made before. Training is broadly defined. I actually do believe in continual training in any occupation. But if training is being considered as a method in which we can allow officers or auxiliary officers to carry firearms at all times, then I would have to challenge that definition of training and see how we can define it more specifically. And again, I do think auxiliary police are an important part to the larger police force, but I do not believe they should be armed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The next member of the public with their hand raised is Stacy Thomas.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for all of your time. I very much do appreciate that you are all volunteers, and you obviously are giving way more time than I do on average. So to echo a couple things, well, first of all, I just want to say, Youth Coalition, I'm 40 years old and I find you inspirational. So keep at the work, keep doing what you're doing. I think you guys are awesome. I also just wanted to say and echo on what so many others have said. I feel like everybody's trying to do the best they can with the information they have, but I feel like there's gaps in the information, and I feel like there are not straight lines at all where it comes to the terminology we're using, the authority that the auxiliary department has, who's giving that authority, where it's documented, et cetera. And without having those clean, straight lines and those clear definitions, I think that it puts us at great risk as a community legally. I think it's great that the lawyer is going to be on the next call, but I don't understand why we don't have him on this call exactly. And I'm not really sure, like, I don't think we should just leave it till next meeting to ask all these questions of him. I absolutely think that all of these questions need to be asked. Like, where does the authority for the auxiliary department come from? You know, who's making that determination? How do we know that we're covered? How do we know that we're within the guidelines of the law? I feel like those are the first questions we should have asked, like when it came to all of this. And at the end of the day, if something happens and we're legally responsible, I feel like we're complicit for not having known that. So I really hope that there is a strong effort from the town committee, et cetera, to really, dot those I's when it comes to the legality of all of this, and to really make clear what those terminology definitions are and what they mean specifically for our auxiliary department. I believe that the chief had been saying that he had been asked to look into the excessive force report. I just have a question for him on that as to whether or not anything did come up in regards to an auxiliary officer being involved in excessive force.
Mr. Lembrich, did you post the use of force reports?
No, we didn't post the use of force. No, we don't make those publicly available. I realize that someone might have access to a redacted copy via Oprah, but that wasn't part of the documents we provided. But Chief, what we did provide was in the FAQ a response to the question of whether there were any uses of force documented by auxiliary officers, and we noted that there was in the 10 years we looked back, we found one, and it was where two auxiliary officers used force to to subdue a suspect in a domestic violence issue who was resisting arrest. So that's the only one that I saw. But you obviously have greater insight on that.
Yep, that's accurate. And to answer the question, there has not been any investigations or complaints of excessive use of force.
Okay. Thank you very much for all of your time. I appreciate that it's late. I'm sure everybody wants to go. Thanks.
Thank you. The next person with their hand raised is Hannah Peralta. Let me take you off of, there we go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, like everyone has said, thank you for your time and volunteering to do all this. By the way, my name is actually Frank Peralta. I'm just using my wife's Zoom.
Oh, I apologize, sir.
No, it's okay. You wouldn't have known. So I've heard that the chief say a couple times tonight, which a statement that I agree with, where he says that we are asking the volunteers to do a job that requires them to have weapons, right? So a question for the chief is, so are you saying that, or are you saying that you need the auxiliary police in their current capacity to be able to achieve the mission, your mission?
Sorry about that. Yes, essentially, yes. As it stands, what we are asking our auxiliary officers to do, and at the time that we're asking them to do that, they would need to be in uniform and they would need to be armed. Over the past 2 to 3 months, we have had several storms. We're going through a pandemic. There's no more. There's no better timing than now that we actually need the assistance from these officers. And it's not just a budgetary thing where there's no doubt that they help with the budget, but more than anything, we need the assistance, particularly now. We were unfortunate to have a pandemic and a major storm, and that wiped us out. So yes, the answer to your question is yes.
Got it. Thank you. I mean, so the chief is saying that he needs the volunteers to perform his mission, and I'll take him, at his word at that. But then every community member that has come on today to express an opinion or ask a question, literally has said that they do not want auxiliary police with weapons. And so there's a big, and I don't have the answer, but there's a big, it just, the people don't want auxiliary police with weapons, but the chief is saying that he needs them. It just, yeah. I don't have the answer for that, but I mean, to me, it's the town is saying they don't want them. So I don't know. But anyway, thank you, Chief, for the clarity on that question.
Thank you, sir. The next individual with their hand raised for public comment is Maria Del Naja.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Oh, thank you so much for staying up late. I'm getting up tomorrow to teach school, so I feel your pain. I want to go to bed too. But thank you for this opportunity to talk. I've been on the Zoom since 7:30, and it feels like the gist of what I have heard in this meeting in regards to this particular topic is that the auxiliary officers need to be armed because they operate with the exact same powers as the paid officers. And those powers have been defended by explaining that the aux officers get trained in exactly the same way and in exactly the same amount as the paid officers. But it seems to me that you can't have it both ways. Are the aux officers fully trained? If yes, then why is all of their time on duty considered training? If you continue to insist that they're still being trained, how can you claim that they should be granted the exact same powers as fully trained full-time paid officers? It's a catch-22. It's some verbal gymnastics that are just not adding up. And honestly, I also struggle to comprehend how you can claim that the aux officers are not being used in lieu of paid officers when they're performing duties alone. If they're the only officer present, then either that duty isn't necessary at all, or it is necessary and it's being completed by an aux officer in lieu of a paid officer. So can anybody speak to those two questions? Are they fully trained or are they not fully trained? Are they being used in replacement for paid officers or are they not being used in replacement for paid officers? Because you can't have both of those things be true.
Chief, I think this may be a semantic issue, but do you want to address that?
Well, I don't think I'm going to give you an answer that you're going to be happy with, but it is training. Training is ongoing, and they certainly are not doing the job as a replacement to our officers.
Okay, thank you, Chief. We have two more hands up for public comment. The next person is Lisa Carney.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. My question is a follow-up on Heather Sislowski's question from earlier. At the last town council meeting, when the 90-day suspension was discussed, we were told that the aux was already on a hiatus since the beginning of COVID. I'm interested to know why that initial hiatus happened when the stated purpose is to support police in times of disaster or emergency.
That was to limit exposure, and during that time they were subject to recall, and they were recalled. But we were limiting them to emergencies.
I thought everything was an emergency.
No, everything is training. Not everything is an emergency.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We are now, our last person who's raised their hand for public comment is Heather Craven. You're on now.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. I had a couple of questions coming out of an earlier public safety meeting. Some members of the auxiliary service had given reasons why they felt they needed to be armed. And it raised some questions to me about the culture of the auxiliary police. One officer mentioned wanting to be armed because he was dealing with high school students. And clearly that's a matter of concern. If members of if youngsters in our community are being seen as threats that need to be handled with weapons. So I would want to know, is that a typical attitude among auxiliary officers? Another example given was approaching a driver at the traffic stop at the scene of an accident, I believe. And the concern was that they didn't know that it was just a random driver. They didn't know whether maybe that person could have a gun in the car or something. As somebody who is a motorist, that alarms me to think that just because I'm behind the wheel of a car, I would be seen as somebody who can only be approached with a weapon. So I would want to know, is that a typical line of thinking for these officers? And finally, clearly there's a very, very strong community feeling against having these auxiliary officers armed. So I would want to know, is there a function of arming these officers that benefits the community? Does this somehow, have these weapons ever been used to protect us as community members? Have they ever made us safer? Does it help protect us, serve us? What's the advantage to the community, if any, of having these officers armed? Thank you.
It's okay. So Chief, that was a number of questions. I'm not sure I got them all, but you know, can you try to address those?
Yeah, Mr. Lembrich, I didn't get a lot of them as well. I believe that the work and service that our reserves have, that auxiliary has provided to the community speaks for themselves. In my 32 years, I've been pleased to be a part of that. I'm glad that they've been there. They've assisted me as a patrolman and all the way up through the ranks. They are residents. They serve with integrity, with nothing, with no agenda other than to serve the community. That's all I want to really say about that. As far as the value to the town, I could tell you their service is invaluable to the town. The service that they provide comes at the time that we need them most. And I can't think of a time that they've ever not come to our aid and our assistance. They're selfless as a unit.
So yeah, Chief, I mean, the question that I got was, you know, basically, how does the auxiliary, you know, protect the community, or how do they contribute to the safety of our town?
They participate in all of the function and events. A lot of that I believe was covered in the report. But they participate in all the functions and events that would not otherwise be able to be held. They come out when we need them in times of storms, in times of great tragedy. That's my best answer. Okay.
Chief, thank you very much. We've reached the end of the public comment. Not seeing any other hands raised. I'm gonna ask if either of my my fellow public safety committee members have anything to add. Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you,
Mr. Mayor.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank everybody for tonight.
Thank you, everyone, members of the public, and also Chief, Deputy Chief, and my fellow committee members, and Ms. Riveros, and the others who were here tonight. Thank you, and we'll take this issue up again, obviously, on Tuesday night. Thank you, and this meeting is now adjourned.